Open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. Good to see everybody. I don't believe that a preacher has to preach a lesson for every holiday. But I do admit that I like to take advantage of the fact that when the holidays come around, you are most likely already thinking about specific things. And in the coming days, you probably will be thinking about specific things. For instance, when Christmas rolls around, whether you celebrate it or not, you're probably thinking more about the birth of Jesus. So maybe I could preach a lesson about the birth of Jesus. I don't know. Or Valentine's Day, whether you celebrate it or not. Maybe if you don't celebrate it, you're thinking about it more. You're probably thinking about love, right? Or something like that. And preach a lesson about that. Well, this holiday, I'm sure you're aware, this is John mentioned in the talk, we're going to be talking about gratitude. And what I want to look at is basically the example that we have of the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness. And what are the lessons that we learn from their example? And in the scripture reading this morning, Jacob read for us 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul says that what is recorded for us about the Israelites and the things that they did, all of that is for our benefit, for us to learn, all right? So what are we supposed to learn from this? Our story starts in Exodus. The people of Israel have been living in Egypt for like 400 years, ever since they journeyed down in the days of Joseph. They've been living for a long time, generation after generation, in Egypt, and a new Pharaoh was appointed in Egypt who apparently knew nothing about the story of Joseph or the Israelites. He had no respect for them. And Pharaoh basically went to himself, we got all these weird people everywhere in our country who are not from here, and if we're not careful, these people are gonna revolt and take over, and they'll be running the show. And so Pharaoh decides that he's going to tell the midwives of the Hebrews to kill the male children that are born to Israel, but spare the women. And then later on, Pharaoh is going to impose horrible, rigorous labor. He's basically trying to suppress Israel through harsh slavery. And so that is what Israel is having to live through in Exodus. And then in verse 23 of Exodus chapter 2, it says, "Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage. And they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them." It's a little bit ironic, but we have this first example, the very beginning of Israel crying out, right? And this time, they are crying out, for perfectly good reasons. They're in bondage, they're in slavery, it's horrible. The conditions that they're having to live in, and they cry out to God, "Save us, Lord." And God hears them. And so I want to start this lesson off by saying, this lesson is going to be talking about complaining. It's not so much going to be talking about gratitude as maybe the inverse of gratitude. It talks about, is there a right time to complain to God? And I think we can see that, yes, it is not a sin to be to look at the circumstances around you and, if things are rough, to cry out to God for help. That is not a sin. That is not a sin. But that is very different from the rest of the examples that we're going to see in Israel. But I want to say from the beginning that simply crying out to God for help, that is not complaining, as we're going to see later on. So God hears this complaint that Israel lifts up to God. And God creates this plan, and he chooses Moses, right? Moses is going to be God's servant. He's going to lead people out of Egypt. And so Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, let God's people sacrifice in the wilderness to our God for a few days. And Moses' response to that is, well, you guys are lazy. You got time to do all of that? You must not be working hard enough. And so Pharaoh imposes a harsher quota of bricks for them to make, and then he quits supplying them with things to make the bricks. And so they have to gather those. And the response that Israel has to all of this is found in chapter 5, verse 21. They said to him, Moses and Aaron, may the Lord look upon you and judge you, for you have made us odious in Pharaoh's sight, and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. A bit of a contrast. When Moses first told the people that God is going to deliver them, it says they worshiped God. They praised God. Yes, God's going to save us. But now that the plan is starting to go in motion, this isn't exactly what they thought would happen. And they take it out on Moses. You aren't doing any good. May the Lord judge you. And this is a consistent theme throughout all of these complaints. It's more often than not because, this is just not the way that I thought it would go. This isn't the way I thought it would work. It shouldn't be like this. They have their own idea of the way that things should work and the way that things happen. And oftentimes that's different from the way that God actually decides to lead them. And so they fire back at Moses and God and complain. And in this instance, in verse 22, Moses turns to the Lord and he says, Lord, why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done harm to this people. You've not delivered your people at all. And so even Moses is caught up in this. He complains at God. However, Moses is going to change later on in the story. As the story goes on, God delivers his people from Egypt. He sends 10 great plagues that wreak havoc on the nation of Egypt, and he delivers his people. And they're on their way out of Egypt, and they get to the Red Sea, and they've got the Red Sea on one side, and on the other side, they see Pharaoh with all of his chariots and all of his horses riding to kill and to slaughter Israel. And they're trapped. They see all of this, so they're looking around, and they turn to Moses in verse 11. It says they said to Moses, of chapter 14, Exodus 14, sorry. It is because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Have you dealt with us this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. So the Israelites complain. Were there not graves in Egypt? You had to lead us all the way out here to die. They're allowing the fear, the intimidation of seeing Pharaoh's army to completely squash any hope that they might have had. And you would think, maybe after seeing all of the plagues that God sent on Egypt, that they would maybe think that it's going to be okay. God's going to take care of them. He saved us from Egypt once, surely he can do it twice. And I don't really know what they were thinking. Maybe they were thinking, God can do like those 10 plagues, but like he never showed us that he could save us from this, right? He showed us miracles in the past, but like this is another kind of miracle. Maybe he can't do that. It sounds silly to us, but I think we do the same thing sometimes. I'm sure all of us have times in our lives where we thought, how is this going to work out? How is God going to take care of me? you know. And then it works out. God takes care of us. And then the next time it happens, we think, this situation is completely different from all those other ones. I don't think God's going to be able to handle it this time. I don't think I'm going to make it. We do the same thing every single time. But in this instance, God divides the Red Sea and he saves his people. And he destroys the army of Pharaoh with the flood. And then in chapter 15, we get our next situation. In chapter 15, the people of Israel are rejoicing, they're shouting, they're glad. In verse 1, Moses and the sons of Israel sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he is hurled into the sea. In verse 11, who is like you among the gods, O Lord? Who is like you? Majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders. You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. In your loving kindness you have led the people whom you have redeemed. In your strength you have guided them to your holy habitation. Now what resounding words of praise. People who have seen the salvation of God firsthand. God saved them from that army. And he did something that none of them could have imagined in order to do it. They're on this spiritual high, And it's a shame that chapter 15 doesn't end there, huh? As the story goes on, verse 22, chapter 15, Moses led Israel from the Red Sea. They went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And then when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter, and therefore it was named Marah, meaning bitterness. And so the people grumbled at Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. He threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. There he made for them a statute and a regulation. There he tested them. And he said, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. So they grumble, what shall we drink? And God provides water for them. The next occurrence in chapter 16. They set out from Elim in verse 1, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, most likely for Sinai, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. And then the whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the sons of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Imagine that. After all that God has done for them, after all the ways he's proved himself. Again, would that we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, is what they say. God provides manna, which is described as some kind of a flake, and it covered the ground every morning except for the seventh day. It's described as a sweet taste, like honey is the way it's described. Doesn't sound terrible, but foreshadowing, they're going to think not great of it. In chapter 17, verse 1, then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people there thirsted for water. And they grumbled against Moses and said, why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, what shall I do to this people? A little more and they will stone me. Does this seem to be getting worse rather than better? You would think after God, made food literally rain down out of heaven for them, they would not be getting worse. They would not be complaining more. But it seems to be worse. I mean, Moses is afraid for his life because of how, I guess, worried these people are about not having anything to drink. And here, the Lord tells Moses to strike the stone with his staff. And Moses does, and water comes out of a rock. And all of Israel is able to drink from that rock. The next complaint that we see is in chapter 32. And that is after they arrive at Mount Sinai, and after Moses has been up at the top, speaking with the Lord, receiving the law. He has been at the top of the mountain. Israel is at the base. And it's been a while. And in Exodus chapter 32, verse 1, it says, "When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, 'Come, make us a god who will go up before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him.' And Aaron goes along with it. He makes a golden calf, and then they worship this golden calf. Now, later on in verse 16, it said, "And the next day they rose early," or verse 6, it says, "The next day they rose early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. The people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play," probably engaging in some kind of sexual immorality, idol worship. All of this happening at the base of the mountain where God's presence was dwelling. Now, there is a question here. Is this really a complaint that the people have? Make us a golden calf. It doesn't really sound like the grumbling like before, but I want to submit to you that it is a complaint. And it is probably the most serious complaint that we've seen yet. Pay attention to the way it's phrased in verse 1. "Come, make us a god who will go up before us." A lot of times we talk about the horrible sin of the golden calf and how bad that was. We don't maybe talk about enough why they did it. I think they were impatient. They disagreed with the way that God was leading them. They were ready to go. There was a promised land on the horizon. They were marching to Canaan. What are we doing at this mountain? Make us a god who will lead us, who will go up before us. This God, Yahweh, he ain't doing much. Make us a god that does what we want, is what they're saying. And that is at the heart of every idolatry. Every time someone worships something other than God, every time we give in to our own desires, we're rejecting God's will. We're rejecting God's leadership. And we're creating a system that we can follow that allows us to do what we want to do. And that, sure, it comes out of selfishness. It comes out of a lack of gratitude. These people were not thinking about how well God had taken care of them, in the wilderness. They were not thinking about any of that by the time that they made this golden calf. But they should have been. They think a golden calf, really? Would that take care of you? Is that what rained down manna from heaven for you? No. Part 2. We get done with those examples in Exodus, and the list only goes on in Numbers. In Numbers chapter 11, In Numbers chapter 10, the people gather together and they're ready. They're leaving Sinai finally. And they're headed straight to the Canaan land. And in chapter 11, verse 1 says this: "Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. And the people therefore cried out to Moses. Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. And so that place was called Taberah, or burning, because the fire of the Lord burned among them." Does it strike you as ironic in verse 1 here? The people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. In Exodus chapter 2, we saw God's people complaining because of adversity, right? Because of their slavery in Egypt. Now they're doing the exact same thing, except now they're complaining about God and the way that He's leading them. Do you see how wrong that is? Then it goes on in chapter 11, verse 4, "The rabble who were among them had greedy desires. And also the sons of Israel wept again and said, 'Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna.'" Pause. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 38, it said, "They departed from Egypt with a great multitude of livestock." What are these people complaining about? We have no meat to eat. Either they slaughtered all of their livestock and ate it just out of gluttony or out of greed, or they're lying because it says they had a great multitude of livestock. And even in Numbers chapter 20, after this event, way after this event, it still says a multitude of cattle, a multitude of beasts. And again, that was given to them by God and provided for them. In Numbers chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron gather together, and they are upset about Moses' wife. And they complain against Moses, disagreeing with God's choice of using Moses to lead His people. And then in chapter 13, they complain that they're not able to take the land. They grumble against the Lord. Why did He bring us up here? These people are too mighty for us. In Numbers chapter 16, a rebellion is started by a man named Korah who disagrees with God's choice of Aaron and of Moses to lead God's people. And then later on in chapter 16, those rebels who allied with Korah, they were swallowed by the earth. God killed those people. And then Israel started complaining at Moses for killing those people. They said, "Moses, you're the one who killed God's people." What? No. And then later on, in Numbers chapter 20, we have the waters of Meribah, take 2. They complain that they don't have any water. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 20, "The sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Now Miriam died there and was buried there, and there was no water for the congregation. And they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron, and the people thus contended with Moses and spoke, saying, 'If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness? For us and our beasts to die here? Why have you made us come up from Egypt?
Chapter 16. Then they set out from Egypt
To bring us into this wretched place. Is it not a place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there water to drink.
of sin, which is between Philip and Simon on the 15th day.
Happens to us all. So they contend with Moses, and this leads to Moses speaking the phrase, "Shall we not bring forth water for you, rebels?" And striking the rock when God told him to speak to the rock instead. And this leads to Moses' downfall. He lifted himself up. He did not treat God as holy. It was the final straw for Moses. And then finally in chapter 21 we have the complaint that there's no food and there's no water. 21 verse 1 says, verse 4. They set out from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. The people became impatient because of the journey. And the people spoke against God and Moses. "Why have you brought us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this miserable food." We loathe this miserable food. I mean, right now, you might be thinking to yourself, this has got to be the most obnoxious and ungrateful people that have ever lived. And in a way, that's justified. The Bible does present it, very impartially, very honestly, right? I mean, they are called out for the attitude that they have at every step of this journey. They are kicking and they are screaming. Homesick for slavery. But I want us to think for a second. Font is messed up. I want us to think for a second. This is a picture of the wilderness. We think wilderness, and sometimes we get in our mind like a jungle, like a dense forest or something like that. And that's a telephone line. They wouldn't have had that. But this was a dry. It was a desert. Scorchingly hot, like unbearable, okay? And it's vast, it's huge. And they wandered in this for 40 years. Of course, it would have been a much shorter trip if they had been able to listen to God in the first place. But they wandered in this for 40 years. And sometimes we don't quite understand that. And it's a little bit easier to look down on them if you don't take into account that it would have been scary. And can you imagine journeying around in this for 40 years in tents, having to pack up your tent every now and then, travel, walk in this scorching heat, set your tent down again, stay the night, stay for who knows how long. I think during these 40 years, some of us would probably have a hard time maintaining a good attitude about it. That's what I think. Are you up for it? 40 years wandering in this? You sure about that? This shows how big the wilderness is. Could you imagine looking out at that and that being your backdrop for that many years? We have this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 1. "In the wilderness where you saw how the Lord your God carried you, just as a man carries his son, in all the way which you have walked until you came to this place. But for all this, you did not trust the Lord your God." Yeah, the wilderness was a harsh environment. But in Deuteronomy, God says, you know what? They were taken care of. And what should that have proved to Israel? To be able to live in a harsh environment that by the way, we're talking like 1 million people at the very least that were supported throughout that wilderness by the miracles that God worked. That is a logistical impossibility. There is no way that works unless it's God that we're talking about. That should have proved to them that they could trust in the Lord their God. In this next point, I want to talk about some of the details that they focused on. In Numbers 20, verse 5, they called the wilderness this wretched place, which, sure, it was. It was a wretched place. But they were saying this wretched place in order to discount the way that God had led them. In Numbers 21, verse 5, we read it a moment ago. We loathe this miserable food, the manna that God fed them with, that they survived on, that they lived on. We loathe it. And what made it worse is they thought things like this. In Exodus 16, in Egypt we had those pots full of meat, and we ate bread to the full. Never mind that they were like killing our children or whatever, but hey, we had full stomachs. In Numbers 11, back in Egypt, we had fish, we had melons, cucumbers, leeks, garlic, onions, like seasoning, dude. It makes me wonder, with Numbers 11 being, a longer distance in time from their slavery than the complaint in Exodus, I wonder whether they kind of glorified their Egyptian meals a little bit more than what was reality. But this is in large part human nature, I think. We look at the circumstances that we are in, and it's natural for us to want what we're used to. It's natural for us to think that maybe somebody else has it better. Or maybe we had it better. Maybe we had it better before we started trying to follow the Lord. And now I'll probably mention that throughout the Bible, this time that they spent in slavery to Egypt, if you were to draw a connection to us, the time they spent in Egypt in slavery is for us the time that we spent in slavery to sin. It's the same principle. God delivered them out of Egypt from that miserable life that they had. And God delivered you from the life of sin that you were in. Do you look back on that life that you had? Do you reminisce about the fish and the leeks and the cucumbers? Do you get stuck on the details? And that's really the big point here. Who cares to be honest, the people of Israel were following God to go to the Promised Land, to Canaan land. Who cares about the manna? Who cares what they ate day after day? They're going somewhere greater. They're going somewhere better. They have an actual hope now, which is more than they could have said for Egypt, right, in slavery. And the application is, who cares today what we eat? Who cares how nice our house is? What kind of car we drive? Who cares? We're going somewhere greater. God has blessed us with all of those things, and we ought not take them for granted. But in the big picture, we also should see that those are just the details. The little things in our life that we have that, maybe are inconveniencing us, keep the big picture in mind. That's what the Israelites failed to do. They got stuck on this wretched place, this miserable food. Don't get stuck on the details. In Numbers chapter 8, or in Deuteronomy chapter 8, sorry. We see God's perspective in all of this. In Deuteronomy 8, verse 2, it says, "You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you, to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He humbled you and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. Thus you are to know in your heart that the Lord your God was disciplining you, just as a man disciplines his son. Therefore, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him." As the chapter goes on, he's telling them that they need to remember this, because they're going to come into a land that is going to be so much more plentiful and bountiful than what they've been in for 40 years. I mean, they're going to have full fields and grain silos, and it's going to be great. But they need to be careful when they are blessed with much, not to forget the Lord. And I think the lesson that God is wanting his people to know is if you are not grateful with what little God has blessed you with, then you are not going to be faithful to God if he blesses you with more. I want to talk about some practical applications about gratitude and what that should mean. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting in verse 10, "It shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of all good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied, then watch yourself, that you do not forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship him and swear by his name. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you. For the Lord your God in the midst of you is a jealous God. Otherwise the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off the face of the earth." There are times where we kind of boil down in our minds gratitude as this, just say thank you for the things that you're given. And that is good. You should say thank you. Thank you should be a very common thing for a Christian to say. But gratitude is more than just that. Gratitude should actually influence the decisions that you make and the way you think. And God is teaching his people in Deuteronomy chapter 6 about practical gratitude. What does a grateful heart do? How does gratitude change what you do? And here he's saying that they ought to be grateful for the way that God took care of them so that they shouldn't follow other gods. In other words, if you recognize that your blessings are from God, and by the way, in James chapter 1, all blessings and every good thing comes down from above, from the Father of lights, from God. If you have a good thing, guess where it came from? God. If you recognize that, how likely are you to go searching for blessings from some other source? How likely are you to trust in your own ability to bless yourself? to seek your own good. Well, you shouldn't. Trust in the Lord to take care of you, that He knows what's best. He provides for you according to what you need. In chapter 6, verse 20, he says, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what do the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments mean which the Lord our God commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us from Egypt with a mighty hand. And moreover, the Lord showed great and distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh and all his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land which He had sworn to our fathers. So the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, and for our survival as it is today. It will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all this commandment before the Lord our God, just as He commanded us. You know, gratitude is not mentioned in these verses by name. Thankfulness is not mentioned by name. But I hope you can see it. I hope you can see it in the tone that these things are said in. Gratitude does something wonderful for us. And that is, it reaches down into your heart. And it causes you to obey from a heartfelt place. You are touched by what God has done for you. So now you observe God's commandments, not in a cold way, not simply because it's a list or anything like that. No, because you know of what God has done for you and the way that He has shown His love. And you want to return that. And you live in gratefulness. And that ought to make an impression on other people. That ought to make an impression on the next generation. And then we have the concept of the Passover. This is one of the more practical ways that gratitude was to be observed or shown. In Exodus chapter 13, we're talked through the whole Passover process. It was a holiday for the Jews to be celebrated once a year. And it was to commemorate the way that God saved them from Egypt. And the quote in verse 8 is that, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And then you have Psalms 113 through 118. They are called the Egyptian Hallel, a collection of psalms that would have been sung during the Passover and in the days leading up to the Passover. And if you go and you read through those songs, do you know what you find? Thanksgiving. You find the account of God's deliverance from Egypt, His mercy to the weak and the needy. You find all those things described in the Psalms, but it's described like in the first person. As in like, the Lord saved us from Egypt. Not, the Lord saved our fathers. The Lord saved our ancestors. No, the Lord saved us from Egypt. And I think the way that should be applied is, in this new covenant we are given in 1 Corinthians 11 and in the Gospels that Jesus instituted His Lord's Supper. The time where believers are to come together and observe, hopefully, in gratitude, the sacrifice and the deliverance that we've been given in Christ. Now that should be observed in a practical way. And I hope that it has an effect on our hearts. And then in Hebrews chapter 10, I'll read that section. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26. It says, For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. And anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God, and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, Vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Do you see the ungrateful attitude in these verses? If we go on sinning willfully after receiving the truth, after hearing it, you know the story of Christ. You know what he's done for you. And yet you turn away and you decide that you're going to do what you want. And you're not going to listen anymore. What you are doing is trampling underfoot the Son of God. You are regarding as dirty, as unclean, the blood of the covenant that purified you from your sins. Would a grateful person do that? Would a thankful heart do that? I don't think so. Gratitude ought to be in the equation when we are fighting off the desires of the flesh, the sin that so easily entangles us. I'm not saying that it's the only weapon that we have against it, but it ought to be there. And now I'll extend the invitation. Are you grateful for what the Lord has done? Well, if you are not a Christian, then no, you are not grateful. And there's an opportunity right now for you to be baptized and for you to live as a Christian and to be led by God just as the Israelites were in the wilderness. Or if you are a Christian and you've fallen into sin, or if you need prayers and you need encouragement, there's an opportunity for you to have those needs met if you come forward while we stand and sing the invitation song.